Chapter 14. Gaoxuan. Jinchi had finished his bath and was savoring a cup of wine. It seemed as if everything that came up these days was a fresh headache. He was at something of a loss, as if everything else vying for his attention hadn't been enough. Just the other day, he had nearly been killed. After what they had learned in the mortuary, the matter of Suide had been taken care of with the utmost circumspection. That was the most convenient for everyone. He queried the mortuary workers who had supposedly brought in coffins while Suide's body had been there, but strangely they claimed not to have received any such requests. About the court lady Suide herself, much remained uncertain. The reason she had been so close with the doctor was because her guardian had been the physician's own teacher. Apparently, this teacher had been Suide's talent for medicine and had adopted her as a daughter some years ago, but little more was known than that. Jinchi saw that this situation was unlikely to go away anytime soon, but that was nothing new. There were many problems that went unresolved, simply piling up. The most he could do with such issues was to bear them in mind for the future. He had to focus on what he could do at this moment. Jinchi was surprised by the crackling of charcoal, but when he looked outside, he saw the world had gone white with snow. It was getting chilly. He picked his robe up from the couch where it lay and slipped it on. A metallic tinkling came from the entrance. The building was designed so that it could be heard from almost anywhere. Jinchi knew who it was likely to be. As he'd expected, his aide, with his perpetually furrowed brow, entered the room.
"She's back safely," Gaoxuan said.
"Sorry to put you through such trouble all the time." Jinchi had instructed Gaoxuan to see Mao back whenever the hour got late. It had been in saving Jinchi, after all, that she had hurt her leg. He worried that if he left her to her own devices, the wound would open again. That wasn't the only thing that concerned him, though. There was also the eccentric lock-on. As far as Jinchi could tell, the man was telling the truth about being Mao's biological father, but Mao's attitude on the subject made it more than clear that their relationship was not the usual one. The general consensus in the palace was that you could never be sure what Lock-on might do, and Jinchi preferred to take no chances. Lock-on had had something to do with Mao's reaching the altar during the ritual as well. No doubt the soldier who'd struck her was by now deeply regretting his actions. One of Jinchi's saving graces was that, unlike some other people of the court, Gaoxuan could read him well enough to know when to leave him alone to do his work. This was, after all, the man who had been assigned to Jinchi as a tutor practically from the moment he was weaned. Notwithstanding a brief separation from Gaoxuan had been sent to do other work, he was certainly among those who knew Jinchi best. When he considered that Gaoxuan's own wife had been his wet nurse, Jinchi saw that he might never outlive his debt to this man. "We'll be at the rear palace tomorrow."
"Yes, sir."
Gaoxuan brought out 2 bowls and a pot. It was full of a sickly sweet liquid. They had to drink it every day in order for it to have its full effect. Gaoxuan poured the contents of the pot into the 2 silver bowls, and then he took the first sip. It was a role Mao might have eagerly assumed, but there would have been no point in having her taste it. It had no effect on women. Gaoxuan frowned even deeper as he drank the stuff down, and then he waited a few moments.
"I think it's all right. Nothing unusual."
Nothing unusual, except the flavor was always unusual. The mixture contained a powdered variety of potato imported from another land, one with a very particular side effect. The potato flour was just one of several ingredients Jinchi and Gaoxuan had to take on a daily basis. Very well. Jinchi picked up his bowl, pinched his nose, and drained it in a single long gulp. He wiped flecks of the liquid from his mouth with the back of his hand, then accepted a cup of cold water from Sweden. 5 years drinking this stuff, and he'd never gotten used to it. "You shouldn't hold your nose like that when people are watching," Sweden said. "I know that." "It makes you look like such a little boy when you do." "I know that." Jinchi sat down on the couch, pouting. His tone of voice, the way he spoke, the way he walked and moved, he had to constantly pay attention to all of it. The eunuch Jinchi was 24 years of age. He straightened up, striving to put on his best official face, but the taste of the medicine still lingered in his mouth, making his lip curl. Gaoxuan frowned.
"You needn't drink it, sir, if you detest it so."
"This is what makes me who I am, as a eunuch." It had been 5 years since the current emperor had taken over the rear palace. 5 years, now nearly 6, that Jinchi had continued to wear this twisted mask. Year after year, taking the medicine that made him not a man. He did it even though the emperor had told him he could do as he wished around the lower-ranked consorts and any ladies less prestigious than they. Gaoxuan touched a hand to the furrows of his brow.
"If you do this long enough, you'll never regain the function."
Jinchi spat his water out at that. He put his hand to his mouth with a reproachful look at Gaoxuan. Gaoxuan looked back at him as if to communicate that every now and again he would have his say.
Well, the same is true for you, Jinshi said. Not so. Why, just last month a grandchild was born to me. Gaoxuan's point seemed to be that his children were already grown. He had no need to produce more offspring. How old are you again? 37.
If Jinshi had his facts straight, Gaoxuan had married at 16, and the couple had had one child each year for the next 3 years. Jinshi's milk brothers. He was particularly close with Gaoxuan's youngest son. In fact, the lad had made himself helpful just the other day during the food poisoning case involving the seaweed. The young man who had accompanied Mao Mao to the official's house. That had been him.
Which of the two elder brothers is it? My eldest son, and I think my youngest could stand to find himself a wife sometime soon.
He's only 19.
Yes, just the same as you, my lord.
Gaoxuan specifically refrained from using the name Jinshi. Jinshi was a 24-year-old man who had become a eunuch 5 years earlier. He couldn't possibly be 19. Gaoxuan clearly thought he was making some sort of point, Jinshi observed. Maybe he felt Jinshi should hurry up and get himself some female companions, as the emperor had done. Jinshi crossed his legs and looked at Gaoxuan as innocently as he could.
I want to hold my grandchild. Soon.
So let's finish this assignment quickly, he seemed to be saying.
I'll see what I can do.
Gaoxuan accepted some hot tea from Sweden and took a sip. Jinshi, ignoring his aide's baleful look, drank the rest of his water. Another routine round of visits to the emperor's ladies had gone without a hitch. Consort Lolan seemed to be integrating into the rear palace without any trouble. The move to bring her in had been somewhat forceful, so it wouldn't have been surprising if her presence had caused discord. But neither Consort Gyokyo or Consort Liwa were short-tempered enough to let the new girl get to them. Yes, there had been the countertemps between the two of them after the births of their respective children, but that had been exceptional. Since then, they had maintained a distant but cordial relationship. As for Consort Lishu, she was much too retiring to be the one to start any fights. It was always possible her ladies-in-waiting could goad her into it, though. He would have to keep an eye on the situation. The residence of the former consort Aduo had become a sorry sight to him under its new occupant. Under the old mistress, there had been not a frivolous furnishing to be seen. But now that the new one had moved in, the pavilion had become an eye-watering riot of ostentatious displays. Consort Lolan's father was a man of whom the former emperor, or rather more precisely the former empress dowager, had been quite fond. It was under him that the number of palace women had ballooned to nearly 3,000. At present, Consort Gyokyo was foremost in his majesty's affections, and Consort Liwa next, but as ruler he could not limit his nocturnal visits only to those two concubines he most favored. If the rear palace helped maintain the balance of power within the imperial court, it could likewise upset that balance. The emperor couldn't afford to mishandle Lolan and was, Jinshi was given to understand, taking care to visit her at least once every 10 days. This could not but dismay the other consorts. Yes, His Majesty was visiting them more often than Lolan, yet who knew who would conceive a child and when and who wouldn't? Even so, compatibility did mean something, and it was clear that Lolan didn't excite the Emperor's interest in the same way as some of his other ladies. Looking at her, Jinshi thought perhaps he could understand why. Back when the apothecary's daughter had given her class, Lolan had been bedecked with a most unexpected accessory, an outlandish ornament featuring the plumes of a bird from the southern lands. But although sometimes Lolan dressed herself in the style of the southern lands, other times she was clad in an outfit from the northern tribes. No sooner had she put on the garments of the east than she traded them for a dress from the west, and each time her hair and makeup changed to complement her outfit. It was enough to make the emperor feel like he was seeing a different person every time he visited. Under those circumstances, he claimed, it was hard for him to get in the mood. Consort Lishu was another who posed a challenge to mood, but for different reasons. The emperor viscerally rejected his father's preferences and refused to touch, let alone bed, a girl who could still have passed for a child. The Empress Dowager's belly bore a great scar, for she had given birth to His Majesty very young, her body still too small for the task. The birth canal had been too narrow, the child delivered by slitting her open. It had been questionable whether the mother would survive the delivery, but she and her child had both emerged safely. The surgery, it seemed, had been performed by a doctor recently returned from foreign lands. His skill had been so superlative, in fact, that although she was scarred, the Empress Dowager's ability to bear children was left intact, and more than 10 years later she conceived and bore again. To the end of his life, these were the only offspring the former emperor ever had. There was, however, a complication. The physician who had attended the first delivery for the Empress Dowager, then a consort, found himself attending almost exclusively on Her Majesty. precisely because of his actions during that first difficult delivery. A child born to the consort of the crown prince at the same time was neglected, with tragic consequences. How could Jinshi not wonder what things might be like now if the current emperor's first child had lived? He shook his head. There was nothing to gain from meaningless fantasies, and he further thought that His Majesty ought to hurry up and get about the business of producing a new crown prince. On this point, he and Gaoxuan were of the same mind. After the lecture, the emperor's visits had increased substantially. The fruits of Mao's labors might come sooner than expected. During Jinshi's visit, Consort Gyokyo's chief lady-in-waiting Hongyang had confessed something to him with concern. The emperor had called at the Jade Pavilion yet again the day before, and her mistress was looking quite fatigued. Hongyang worried for her. The disheveled appearance of her jet-black hair bespoke the great effort to which the lady-in-waiting was putting herself. Gaoxuan seemed to relate to her. Hongyang, for her part, didn't seem averse to Gaoxuan at all, but as he already had a wife to look after and henpeck him, each as necessary, they would have to disabuse her of any interest sooner or later. All this led Jinshi to believe he had the perfect solution. Gyokyo agreed without a second thought. Hongyang made a point to look put upon, but quietly seemed to welcome the idea. She said as much to the three ladies-in-waiting who had been eavesdropping at the door. It seemed Jinshi had made the right choice. "The rear palace, sir." "That's right. Back to your favorite job." Mama was polishing a silver eating vessel to a mirror-like shine. When she was certain it didn't have so much as a smudge on it, she put it back on the shelf. Her leg still wasn't quite better, so she did a lot of her work sitting in a chair, but Sweden made sure that she did have work to do. A real stickler, that woman was. Jinshi was eating a tangerine, very literally. He wasn't even peeling it himself. Sweden did that, carefully removing the thin rind and setting each piece on a plate in front of him. What a spoiled brat. The old attendant seemed to have a habit of indulging Jinshi. She would bundle him in a cotton jacket when it was cold or cool down his tea because it was hot. An adult man should have been embarrassed to be treated that way. "It would appear Consort Gyokyo has ceased to walk the path of the moon." The path of the moon was a polite term for menstruation. So she might be pregnant, Mama thought. 2 separate attempts had been made to poison the consort while she was pregnant with Princess Lingli. The culprit had never been found. Mama could understand why Jinshi might be uneasy. "And when am I to begin my new assignment?" "Would it be possible today?" "Possible? I would positively prefer it." As men were not allowed in the rear palace, she would be free of any possibility of bumping into the one person she didn't want to meet, whose name she didn't even want to hear. Perhaps Jinshi had arranged this change of workplace out of consideration for her, or perhaps it was simply an opportune coincidence for him. Mama decided she didn't care which. She thought she was exercising admirable self-restraint, but then Sweden said, "Ah, good news, my dear." Apparently Mama wasn't hiding it as well as she thought. "Not to speak of," she said. "Too bad for me. I thought I'd finally found a protege worthy of my training." Mama, a touch terrified by the grinning Sweden, determined to finish her work as quickly as she could. Chapter 15. Rear Palace Redux. "I used to think I didn't like this place, but I guess I was wrong," Mama thought with surprise. She was finding life in the rear palace, now that she was finally back, quite congenial. She'd grown up in another place full of women, so maybe the rear palace simply clicked with her. Her days once again consisted of tasting food, mixing medicines, and taking little walks. Her leg still wasn't healed, and she'd been given explicit instructions not to go out too much, but in her opinion, she was fine so long as she avoided anything strenuous that might open the wound again. Frankly, her left arm proved she was nowhere near so delicate. The question of Gyokyo's pregnancy still wasn't definitively settled. When she had been pregnant with Princess Lingli, she hadn't suffered from any severe morning sickness, and her food preferences had hardly changed. Other than the delay in her menstruation, there was no evidence one way or the other. Nonetheless, a gag order was imposed on the Jade Pavilion so as not to take any chances. If there were any who didn't wish to see Consort Gyokyo with child, they would certainly want to strike during the early stages, when the pregnancy would be most vulnerable. Poison was just one of many concerns. For good measure, the sex-crazed old man, i.e. the emperor, was discouraged from nocturnal activities at the Jade Pavilion for the time being. Normally, this wouldn't have been a problem, but ever since Consort Gyokyo had begun to put the things she learned at the consort's seminar into practice, normal no longer seemed to apply. There was no telling what might happen. Maybe I should have taken it a little easier on the lessons, Mama thought. But no, then Gyokyo and even the emperor would have wound up dissatisfied, even if the end result of her approach had been to terrify Consort Lishu and cause Consort Liwa's women to view Mau Mau as even more of a monster. Mau Mau naturally hesitated to raise a subject with the Emperor herself. It was hardly something for a maid to bring up with His Majesty, so she communicated through Jinshi instead. Though she couldn't quite make the suggestion explicitly, her hope was that the ruler would continue to visit Gyokyo exactly as often as he had before, no more and no less. After all, while Gyokyo wasn't His Majesty's only consort, if he were to suddenly visit her less often, some observant soul might sniff out the truth. To her surprise, the Emperor continued to visit as faithfully as he ever had, playing with his adorable daughter and passing the time in idle conversation with Gyokyo. Mau Mau was reminded, as she had been of Ado's story, that perhaps she shouldn't dismiss the Emperor as simply sex-crazed. Or, again, perhaps His Majesty grasped the implications of his actions better than she gave him credit for. Some people regarded the current ruler as a sort of sage king, and while some of this was because almost anyone would have looked competent after the buffoon that the previous emperor had been, Mau Mau did believe that the current ruler had his wits about him. Not that it really matters to me, she thought. As long as he let life go on and didn't exact outrageous taxes, she was happy. Some said the real difference between a foolish ruler and a brilliant one was that a foolish ruler thought the people were inexhaustible, while a brilliant one realized that they had their limits. If that was so, well, the present emperor was certainly the latter. Still, she saw the lonesome faces he occasionally pulled, so she decided to pass along the rest of her teaching materials. They would help him pass the time, if nothing else. It needn't be said exactly what kind of teaching materials they were. She'd made sure to have a number of different books on hand just in case, but unfortunately none of the ladies-in-waiting had been interested in them. He'll just have to make do with 2 dimensions. Mau Mau placed the materials where they would be unobtrusive but noticeable, and luckily it seemed he spotted them. When a few days later she was ordered to prepare more such materials, she decided that maybe sex-crazed was the right way to describe him after all. There was a penchant for rumor-mongering in the rear palace, most likely attributable to the boredom generated by the endless routine and the perennial shortage of the opposite sex. Thus, when the ladies-in-waiting didn't have much to do, they found themselves chatting in the kitchen. For snacks, they had the cast-offs from the latest tea party. Today it was long jutong, dragon's beard candy, a treat made of delicate fibers that melted in the mouth. This one had tea leaves mixed in, giving it a faint aroma. "I couldn't believe that outfit, could you?" Yinghua, one of the Jade Pavilion's ladies-in-waiting, sat around a mouthful of candy. She was a self-possessed woman, more than willing to say what she thought. "It's true, but that thing she wore a little while ago, I thought that was nice. Western clothing is so cool, isn't it?" said Gaiyuan in a mild tone. She was smiling, happy just to be enjoying a sweet treat. "Clothes like that choose their own wearers," Ailan observed, "but hers have never looked bad on her." The lanky lady-in-waiting wasn't big on sweets and was simply sipping some tea at the moment. Yinghua, looking wounded by her friend's faithlessness, tuned to her last refuge, Mau Mau. "Yeah, sure," Mau Mau said, nodding and privately thinking how she hated to get dragged into these spats. That was as far as her engagement in the conversation went. Yinghua, her hopes of reinforcement disappointed, puffed out her cheeks. "Well, I thought Consort Ottawa was much cooler." She took an angry sip of tea without ever pulling her cheeks back in. Gaiyuan and Ailan grinned at each other. "Well, it turns out you were on Team Ottawa all this time, Yinghua." I was not," Yinghua exclaimed. Ailan just smirked. "You don't have to hide it. I know we serve Lady Gyokyo, but no one would blame you for feeling the way you do." "I don't feel that way." Mau Mau listened to the girl's chatter as she drank the rest of her tea. She much preferred savory treats. The cottony candy was too sweet for her. She would have loved to have some salty rice crackers to fresh her palate. As for who exactly Yinghua and the other girls were talking about, it was the newly arrived consort, Lolan. She had one unusual quality, which was more than enough to inspire conversation. Which quality? Her clothes. Virtually every time she appeared, she wore an outfit with a different personality. One day she might be in a Western dress, the next she would be outfitted like a rider from one of the tribes. I wonder what the story is, Mau Mau thought. Maybe she just had too much money. If she kept changing outfits at that pace, pretty soon her pavilion would be crammed with clothing. The formerly austere Garnet Pavilion had already changed beyond recognition, as if the new resident were intent on banishing the spirit of Ottawa. It was both the right and wrong thing to do. On the one hand, the rear palace was a world in which one got ahead by standing out, but on the other, the nail that stuck up, as they said, would be pounded down. Lolan might have found herself to be such a nail under normal circumstances, but her father was an important advisor from the days of the former emperor, so there was, as it were, no hammer big enough for the job. That explains a lot, Mama thought. That would be more than enough reason to drive Otto out. Considering Lolan's age, it might even have seemed a bit belated. Then Mamo had a thought. Might it not have been more convenient in some ways for the emperor had Otto remained in the rear palace? Because she could never be a mother of the country, her eyes were fixed straight ahead. She was so perceptive and intelligent, one might wish she had been born a man. And now, at a stroke, the emperor had lost an excellent advisor and gained a young woman who might influence not only the rear palace, but the greater court itself. Perhaps it hadn't seemed to him the most advantageous trade. He couldn't simply ignore her, but it wouldn't necessarily be to his benefit to get too friendly with Lolan and have her conceive a child. A consort's backer was really only powerful during a child's minority. Once the boy became emperor, even had a child of his own, such a person could find himself altogether extraneous. So what did that mean? Mau Mau entertained the possibilities as she helped herself to another cupful from the little teapot.